Hello, and thank you for having me here today. It's an amazing lineup, and I feel very humbled actually to be part of this whole day. It's just absolutely fantastic. I've been asked to talk about what creative placemaking is, and the arts, and how this might be exercised in a 21st century new town. I'm not here in my Tate capacity as such, though I know there are Tate Exchange people in the room. I have spent all of my working life basically working in arts in the public realm in some shape or form. And my research, my PhD, was around socially engaged work in place. So that's kind of where I'm coming at from here. So I'm going to start with some examples of what people first define as placemaking and then creative placemaking. And I'm going to turn attention to the art and artist's role in that. And then I'll ponder a little bit on what that might mean for the 21st century new town. I don't have the answers to that. I think that will all be in the room. So, are we going forward? So before we understand what creative placemaking is, we need to know what placemaking is. And if you've done a Google search on that, you'll come away from it really confused, and you're not the only one. In all of my working life, I've not seen one single definition of placemaking. And there's several reasons for that. Definitions are very much avoided. That could be because placemaking is so new, we don't actually know what it is. It also could be that the term is really overused and has become perhaps disabused and diluted from its original intent. We have a developer's understanding of placemaking here. I'm not picking on Lend-Lease as only one particular example, but developers will be saying the same sort of thing here. And it's very much about that interweaving of their particular business skills with place. But then from a kind of more non-commercial perspective, Glasshouse is an example here. It doesn't name placemaking as its practice as such, but you've got that people element in there in the making of places, which perhaps intuitively reads as what you think placemaking might be. And you don't get very far in your Google search on what is placemaking until you find Project for Public Spaces. Perhaps a self-appointed spokespeople for the sector, but even them as a very self-named placemaking agency doesn't define what placemaking is, and it chooses to describe it or explain it more for what it does. So you could be left wondering, is placemaking even a thing? If people can't define it, if it's so quite amorphous or slippery. And actually not having a definition of placemaking can really be used to your advantage in the field. You can define your own place in that, and I'm going to show you what my definition is in a moment. But I actually don't think not defining placemaking does placemaking any favours. So just as with the terms green or eco, they're used to the real point of losing any meaning and become real just marketing terms, really. That's kind of what's happening with placemaking. And the projects of placemaking, of the cinemas, the pop-up parks, and all that kind of thing, it's looking very samey. It's all looking very, very similar. And that's something which my colleague Stephen Pritchard very rightly begins to point towards. We're coming towards a sort of place wash in terms here. I'll obviously let Stephen talk to that in more detail anyway. Now, coming towards my own understanding of placemaking, I'm going to turn to two people. And my intent in placemaking is really anchored in the work of Holly White and Jane Jacobs. Holly heralded this approach to urban design to focus on the life in between buildings and in the public spaces. And he looked for hours and hours and hours about how people were reappropriating their places. Jane Jacobs is infamous for her ballet of the streets, analysis and interpretation of how people use their neighbourhoods. And together, White and Jacobs, their work focused on the social and cultural and importance of lively neighbourhoods and public spaces that people actually want to spend time in as well. And Jacobs really keenly encouraged everyday citizens to take ownership of their streets as well. Now, White and Jacobs are kind of like the poster children for the foundations of placemaking, but of course they weren't acting in isolation. They were very much part of that new urbanism movement, which is completely simpatico with new towns at that time. And I think it's really important to hold this kind of true intent as we go through the day in considering placemaking. Now, it's probably easiest for me to begin to get to my own understanding of what placemaking is to talk about what it isn't. So it's not a piece of star architecture. That is architecture. It's not a cool, funky bus stop or what have you. That should actually just be what we consider in urban design as a general thing. It's not putting sculpture in a public square, because that is the job of public art, and that does it very, very well. But you begin to put these things together, but really importantly, put the community in that, and that's when we're getting towards what placemaking is. Now, this is a project I worked on in Indianapolis with Arts Collective Big Car. If you ever see me speak before, I would have mentioned them because I think they're brilliant. Big Car were asked by the community here to help them reconnect their community. It was a Jewish and Italian community living together for generations, and they were completely then divided by this freeway coming through them and above them. Now, painting an abstracted vision of a garden on a walkway underneath a freeway is not really placemaking. But what it did do was get that community talking to each other again. Connections were made, remade, made anew. And in those conversations of designing and devising this garden and then going out and painting it, and this was a mammoth effort to get this done in one day, that's when other issues of place were being talked about, and people started to complain and then also come up with suggestions as well. And that is where we're going towards in what I consider to be placemaking, true placemaking. So for me, placemaking is more than just planning and designing processes or putting art through those processes. Placemaking for me uses the existing aspects of a place to their best effect, and it facilitates creative patterns of activities and connections, and that's social, economic, cultural, environmental, and that define a place and support its ongoing evolution. The moment you take the community out of that as being central to that process or being spearheading that process, then for me that isn't placemaking any longer, and the radical potential of this as a place-based process is completely lost. So there's a form of placemaking, and we've been named it today, that has a sort of definition attached to it, and that's creative placemaking. Now, this was a term that Anne Marcuson and Anne Gadwa Nicodemus, the Anns, as I'm going to call them, they came up with in 2010. The National Endowment for the Arts in the States, that's Arts Council equivalent, had noticed a real upsurge in community groups or artist collectives working at the grassroots, applying for funding that was very much arts-led but place-based sort of projects. And they wanted to know what this was about. So hence the Anns were commissioned to look into that, and the white paper emerged. Now this statement, it's on page 3 of the executive summary, if you want to get to this very quickly when you go and see it. It aimed to explain what the function of the arts were in this kind of placemaking. And it has become a bit of a standard definition. You'll see it referred to quite widely, actually. And I think that was a sign, actually, that people were really desperate for something to hold on to when they were defining what they were doing. Now, the Anns never expected this to take hold in just the way that it did. You'll see in here the sort of common tropes of placemaking, something that marries the public and private, uses the arts in regeneration, has a fiscal benefit as well as a social and cultural one. But yeah, as I said, the Anns, they didn't expect this to take hold as it did. It wasn't ever offered as a kind of definitive definition of creative placemaking. And they've gone on since, in the years since, they've gone nearly 10 years since, to really unpick this and really critique it, particularly from positions of race and power and of the environment as well in particular. And also looking at the relationship of creative placemaking with gentrification and regeneration. And the answer to that in very short terms, it's a very difficult relationship. But we can see in this, though, this quite overt mention of the arts and culture as a tool and mechanism for placemaking. Now, in my own research, I looked at an arts-led and place-based practice that I came to call social practice placemaking, kind of does what it says on the tin. This came from me seeing and particularly working in more socially engaged artists turning towards the social and material of place as their site of work. This is Project Row Houses in Houston's 9th Ward in the States. It was founded by artist Rick Lowe from a very simple desire for him as an artist to want to give back to his community. Project Row Houses now has become a huge concern within Houston. It's housed people, it's got people back into work, it's got people back into education, and its multiplier effect is just phenomenal. So a project such as Project public row houses, to me, sums up this real radical potential of placemaking, working from and with the people of place, placing the assets of regeneration, the building and the land in their control. And you'll see neighbourhoods really turn around. And particularly with project row houses, this notion of value in place has completely changed. And actually this whole area, its reputation within Houston has changed, and it's changed the way that the City Council think about it. Now, coming in through this sort of more grassroots, sort of socially engaged way, through this lens in particular, creative placemaking as an arts-based activity in the public realm is a co-produced practice. It's one that's also concerned with process as much as it is any material output. The artist might be an instigator or a catalyst of activity, but they'll work in equanimity with the community to create shared outcomes, shared outputs. And the artist's aim really is never to own that project. It's always for the community to have it, and it's their legacy to continue it. Now this, for the artist, and it means, you know, working in this relative expertism that's not of this sole singular authorship of their project that they're doing. It demands the artist gets really into the public realm, that they're hands-on with it, that they're really working with the people of the place, and they're also questioning the politics of the place. I'm going to turn to artist Jana van Heesek, who said something years ago in my career, and it's stuck with me ever since. And that's that the community are the experts in being the community. And this is part of the foundational stone of a radical placemaking. So the artist, the architect, the planner, the urban designer, me as a placemaker, we all bring our own expertism to that placemaking table, but the community is the expert in their own lives and in their own place. And you forget that, and we're beginning to drift away from what I think, you know, true placemaking is and should be. I'm going to touch very quickly on two artists just to name check them. They might be ones that you'd want to go and look up some more. So Whitehead, Francis Whitehead, has a sort of manifesto, what artists know. So this is a whole list of the other things that artists do in place. So it's beyond their sort of material practices or their theoretical frameworks. You know, it's the skills that artists have, the processes and methodologies that they use in place and to question place. And also things like, you know, they're very good at engineering as well, artists that work in place. Another is an artist, Tanya Bruguera, and her concept of art utile. That roughly translates into English as useful art, but it goes really further, suggesting art as a tool, a device, drawing on artistic thinking to imagine, create, and implement tactics about how we act in society. That can be very politically motivated projects, particularly for Tanya and her concern with migration, but I see that very much being implemented into place-based projects as well. So I'm going to close, but I'm going to go back to the start to do that. The quote I used in the title of my talk was from a participant in a creative placemaking project that had been sort of galvanised or sort of kick-started by an artist. This participant at first couldn't see where the art was in the community kitchen that they were building. But seeing the outcomes of this project, that's when he kind of got it. He said, you know, this is the art. He said, the art is in what we're doing. So what does that mean for new towns? Oh, go back, sorry. I talked of the artist first and foremost as an essential member of the creative placemaking team. And I hope I offered some roots into thinking about what creative placemaking and its art should and can be. I also talked of the artists as I think of their potential, the potential of their role in the making and remaking of our contemporary new towns is quite emblematic of placemaking's radical potential and vice versa. So we know how to do the stuff of urban planning design very differently now, and we have a whole sector of artists and creative practitioners that specialise in doing just that. So what does this mean for new towns? Could new towns be at the forefront of harnessing that radical potential of creative placemaking, that different way, that inclusive master planning? Taking the experimental of new towns, could that marry with the ideas of creative placemaking and be put to use in the piloting of ideas and solutions to people of new towns? So true placemaking doesn't work with or towards the ideal, but with the real. It's a really messy process, it's a conflicted process, and it's open to a really healthy critique. New towns, in a similar sort of way, are still a work in progress. They are being lived in, they're being adapted all the time. They're a very live critique. And placemaking as an approach with its iterative milestones, its tactical interventions, I'm wondering whether that actually could be a really good match in this endeavour for new towns. Thank you.